But Richard, here's how I see it. She got caught. She got caught. She had an epiphany once she got caught. And I am looking at her qualifications, and I am looking at her record. And I don't know that she didn't help write this letter. I know she signed it. And I know she tried to hide it from this committee. Professor, I'm looking at a letter dated March 16, 2020. It's a letter to Governor Lamont in Connecticut. The title of it is Urgent Action Needed to Protect Individuals in Connecticut's Prisons and Jails from Coronavirus 19 Pandemic. Did you sign that letter?
So I don't recall sitting here today, Senator.
Here's your signature. Here is back here. Why didn't you turn this over to us when you were asked to submit documents?
So, Senator, I made every effort to search for everything that I had ever signed. That's not a letter I remember, but I will certainly take a look at that. And
we found it was with a search on the internet.
So I apologize, Senator. I apologize.
In your letter to the governor, here's what you say. As they stand, prisons and jails are detrimental to public health and human rights and disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, people engaged in sex work and street economies, and people experiencing houselessness and poverty. So if you believe that about our prisons, how are you going to ever send somebody to prison?
So, Senator, I will need to take a look at that letter, and I apologize that that's not something I found to hand to this committee.
You're not denying you said that.
I do need to see the letter to see the context, because again, it's not something I remember adding my name to. Yeah. I can assure you, right. Senator.
And you also say, first, you call on Governor Lamont to release everybody in jail. Is that right? Because of the coronavirus?
So again, Senator, I would need to see that letter in front of me. It certainly was not.
You can find it with, just put your name into Google. You'll find it in about 3 nanoseconds.
I will, Senator. I can assure you that
You said in your letter, Professor, we call on Governor Lamont, state of Connecticut, and all Connecticut jurisdictions to immediate release to the maximum extent possible people incarcerated pre-trial and post-conviction. And then you go on to say, talking once again about our jails, the global COVID-19 pandemic is throwing into sharp relief the untenable state of our penal system and the need for sustained action to shrink its scale, shrink its size, and shrink its scope. You sound here like the district attorney in San Francisco. If you believe that, how are you going to ever send us anybody to jail, Professor?
I can assure you, Senator, that I understand the role of the judge, and that I can assure you prison time is an appropriate sentence in many cases.
That's not what you say here to the governor. You wrote the governor. This isn't some DoorDash delivery guy. You wrote the governor of your state 3 years ago.
So again, Senator,
in law school.
So again, Senator, I would need to look at the letter. It sounds like it was written at the height of the pandemic, where governors were looking for.
You also wrote the governor, you said, people over the age of 55 are at the greatest risk for COVID-19, but also pose the least public safety risk to our communities. People in this age group can and should be released immediately to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. You think the governor just, if you're over the age of 55, he should let everybody go?
No, Senator, that's not a position.
That's what you said.
Okay.
Here it is, biggest house.
Again, Senator, I will look at that letter. I can assure you that.
Find it on Google, Professor. You also say Governor Lamont should issue an executive order to direct the state's attorneys attorney offices and law enforcement entities, including the town and city police departments, and any federal law enforcement entity operating within the state to immediately cease adding to the incarcerated prison population given the high risk of infection posed by the population increase. You asked the governors to tell every law enforcement official in the state to stop arresting people and putting them in jail, didn't you?
So again, Senator, I have to look at that letter.
remember.
I do think there were modifications that the governors were making around the country to respond to the
You also
pandemic.
had an opinion in your letter about, can I have another 30 seconds, Mr. You had an opinion in your letter about immigration. You said immigration detention poses the same health risks to jails and prisons, and Connecticut law enforcement must stop feeding people into the unsafe and inhumane immigration detention system. Then you say Governor Lamont should release all individuals currently in state custody who are waiting transfer to ICE custody, and the governor should declare a moratorium on all such future transfers. How, if somebody is in our country illegally and commits a crime, are you going to put them in jail if you believe this about immigration?
Senator, I can assure you, were I so fortunate to be confirmed, I would treat crimes
That's not
seriously.
what this letter says, Professor, and it was 3 years ago. It wasn't when you were in law school, and you didn't turn it over to us. We had to find it on our own.
Senator Kennedy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Russell sent a letter to the governor of Connecticut during the pandemic. Here's what she said, quote, "As they stand, prisons and jails are detrimental to public health and human rights and disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including Black, brown, indigenous, and other communities of color, immigrants, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, people engaged in sex work and street economies, and people experiencing houselessness and poverty." Then she went on to request the governor to immediately release everybody in jail in Connecticut. It's unclear to me whether she was talking about just during the pandemic or on a permanent basis. Then she goes on to tell the governor of Connecticut to stop putting people in jail. And it's still unclear to me whether she meant just for the duration of the pandemic or on an extended basis. And on top of all of that, the cherry on top, she didn't turn the letter over to the committee. I don't know why she didn't. Perhaps she thought, I'm not saying this is the case, she thought we wouldn't find it. It took about 7.3 minutes on Google to find it. Now, this is America. Ms. Russell has a constitutional right to believe in these things and to say those things. She does not have a constitutional right to be a federal judge. And she's not qualified to be a federal judge if those are her beliefs. How can any criminal defendant in front of her or any prosecutor in front of her think that they're getting a fair shake in light of this letter when she sentences someone to prison, if she ever does sentence someone to prison? It's just simply breathtaking. And for that reason, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be voting no. Senator Blumenthal's comments. But Richard, here's how I see it. She got caught. She got caught. She had an epiphany once she got caught. And I am looking at her qualifications, and I am looking at her record. And I don't know that she didn't help write this letter. I know she signed it, and I know she tried to hide it from this committee. So even if you agree with her that we should stop, that actions have no consequences, and that nobody's ever responsible anymore, and it's always somebody else's fault when a criminal sodomizes a young girl, and everybody ought to get a trophy. I mean, I wish we lived in a world like that, but that's what she believes. And you know it, and I know it. And she has recanted after she got caught, and she got caught because she didn't turn it over to us, for God's sakes. Senator, we had to find it on our own. Shame on her. And every single time when she has got to, on the federal bench, she has got to sentence a criminal defendant, this is going to be grounds for appeal. For God's sakes, does the rule of law mean nothing?
The
I'm
Senator
sorry,
yield for a
Senator.
question.
Certainly I do, Senator, and I apologize for not yielding,
that's-
Senator.
Chair recognizes Senator Cornyn.
Thank you for yielding for the question. Is the senator from Louisiana familiar with a concept called confirmation conversion? Kind of like a deathbed.
I would like to hear
conversion.
more about it, Senator.
Well, I'd just be interested, how can you reconcile the letter with what Senator Blumenthal, the senator from Connecticut, read as her disavowal of the letter? Did she express regret, or that she had misspoken, or that she now, on second thought, had different ideas? I'm trying to get my head around how do you reconcile this letter that you read from the statement that the senator from Connecticut.
Well, Senator, here's how I reconcile it. 3 words. She got caught. She got caught. And we found the letter. And she didn't turn it over. And during committee, instead of saying, yeah, I signed the letter, and I shouldn't have done it, I don't believe that. First, she said she wasn't sure. And then she was sure. And then she didn't mean it. And then she'll make a pinky promise that she'll be a fair federal judge. These positions are for life. They're there forever. At a minimum, just because you've seen My Cousin Vinny doesn't qualify you to be on the federal bench. At a minimum, there ought to be a minimum level of integrity and a minimum level of adherence to the rule of law. And this lady sets a new standard. And I wish you didn't have to say that, but those are the facts.
Would the senator yield for one last question?
Of course.
Are you familiar with the fact that all federal judges are subject to a code of judicial conduct?
Yes, sir.
That would be all federal judges, correct?
Yes, sir.
Including members of the United States Supreme Court.
Yes, sir.
And is the senator aware of the fact that that code of judicial conduct that applies to all federal judges was actually promulgated in 1919?
Yes, sir. I understand that's the case.
And I'm trying to reconcile the chairman's statement that this code of judicial conduct that applies to the Supreme Court specifically, that was issued on November the 13th, that was the first time that members of the Supreme Court were subject to a code of judicial conduct. isn't it the fact that the Code of Judicial Conduct that applied to all federal judges applied to them as well?
Yes, sir.
And one of those, how can a litigant, a citizen accused of a crime, somebody who goes to court to seek vindication for a wrong done to them, how can they have any confidence whatsoever in a judge that won't tell the truth?
They can't. And shame on us for allowing someone like that to get on the federal bench.
Now, we've talked a little bit about judicial independence here. I think I agree with those people over time, over the last 230 years or so, who've said that the independence of the judiciary in the United States is a single most distinguishing feature of our form of government. Because ultimately, people are going to be held accountable, and not for political reasons, not because of their unpopular point of view, but because a judge in some court, perhaps with an appeal to an intermediate court and maybe the Supreme Court, has said, you were wrong and the other side was right. But we also said that these judges should be independent of politics. That's why they get lifetime appointments. That's why the Constitution says their salary cannot be diminished while they serve in office. So what recourse does a litigant, a citizen accused of a crime, or the prosecutor who's representing the state or perhaps the United States, what recourse do they have against somebody who's confirmed as a federal judge who won't tell the truth?
It's a mystery to me, and we're creating a real problem here, in my opinion, Senator. And a real problem for the efficient operation of our court. I mean, if I'm a criminal defendant or a criminal defense attorney, I'm going to do everything I can to try to get this lady as my judge. And if I'm a prosecutor, I'm going to try to avoid her, and I think this letter may very well be grounds for appeal in every single solitary case. I mean, she says it here. Big as Dallas. I don't believe in putting people in jail. If they're part of this particular group that she deems virtuous. Now, if you're not in her group of people that she deems underprivileged and virtuous, you're really at risk, apparently. But if you can fit yourself into, if you can somehow become black, brown, indigenous, an immigrant, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who use drugs, if you can convince the judge that you have been engaged in sex work and street economies, or you are homeless or poor, then she thinks you should not be in jail.
I've heard it said that the single most powerful public official in the United States is a individual federal judge. Have you heard that?
Yes, sir. I think that's.
And what recourse does Congress have to a federal judge who blatantly disregards their obligations under the law? Do we have the authority to force them to recuse or disqualify them? Isn't it fact that given the constitutional independence of the judiciary, the sole recourse that Congress has, I'm not talking about the litigants, that Congress would have would be to impeach, for the House to impeach and the Senate to convict them in a court of impeachment. Isn't that right?
That is correct, and that's why I've always been so proud to sit on this committee, because our job is to stop people from getting on the bench who are whack jobs.
And that same limitation of remedy that Congress would have would also apply to a United States Supreme Court justice, correct?
Yes, sir.
Impeachment by the House, conviction in the Senate, and removal from office. That's the sole remedy, correct?
Yes, sir.